Okay, good evening, everyone. Jump right in. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. So we're doing a series on Pali literature, and we've dealt with the Sutta Pitaka and Vinaya Pitaka. And today I'm going to talk about the Abhidhamma Pitaka. The Pali Canon, as probably most of you know, is divided into three Pitakas or baskets. It's the Suttas, the discourses of the Buddha, the Vinaya, the rules and procedures for bhikkhus, and the Abhidhamma Pitaka. Now, first thing, talk about the Abhidhamma Pitaka in general before I get into the specific books, of which there are 7. The Abhidhamma Pitaka is most likely somewhat later in composition than the other two. It does not seem to have been rehearsed at the first council, for instance, although there is one tradition that says Sariputta at least recited the Matakas. The Matakas, it's a technical term. It's close to what we would call in English a table of contents. Each or at least most of the Abhidhamma books will have a Mataka associated with them, which is really just the headings of the different chapters. Interestingly, the traditional funeral chanting in Thailand, at least, and I'm not sure about other Buddhist countries, but traditional funeral chanting includes the Matakas from a couple of the Abhidhamma books. The traditional account found in the commentaries for the origin of the Abhidhamma is that the Buddha spent one rainy season teaching in Tawatingsa heaven, teaching the gods. And every day he would return to earth for his alms round and his meal. And there he would meet with Sariputta, and he would give him a brief summary of what he taught in the heavens to the Devas. And Sariputta took this teaching and put it together as the Abhidhamma. So this tells us, although this is quite a kind of legendary, fanciful story, it tells us at least that the tradition put a very high value on the Abhidhamma, giving it a kind of divine origin. It's what the Buddha taught in heaven to the Devas, and what we have on earth is considered to be a sort of a dumbed down version, simplified version that fit for human consumption. The name Abhidhamma means the higher teaching, or the teaching beyond. So it was given a very high value. Now, why it's suspicious that the Abhidhamma is actually really datable that early, is datable to the Buddha's time or the time of the first council, is that each of the different Buddhist schools had a quite separate Abhidhamma. Whereas the Sutta Pitaka and the Vinaya Pitaka, we can compare the Pali versions with, for example, the Agamas in Chinese that are translated from the Dharma-guptaka Sanskrit, and find a very close correlation. And the same pretty much goes for the Vinaya. The Abhidhammas are quite separate for all the different schools, so Abhidharma in Sanskrit. what it may mean is that the Abhidhamma became, for each of the different schools, something in the nature of a manifesto, expressing their particular detailed understanding of the Dhamma. This is how we understand it. This is how we make sense of it. But we're just going to deal today with the Theravada Abhidhamma, which is, of course, in Pali. The style and tone of the Abhidhamma text is quite different than the tone and style of the Sutta Pitaka. The Abhidhamma is entirely technical, and it has no narrative sections or stories or any kind of similes, this kind of things that embellish the Sutta Pitaka. So it makes pretty dry reading. The original canonical Abhidhamma consists of these 7 books. Most of what people study when they study Abhidhamma is not actually the original canonical text, but the material from the canonical period, like the Abhidhamma Sangaha, which I'll get to in a later talk. Many of the ideas that we're familiar with, for those who have looked into Abhidhamma at all, they actually come from the commentarial period. The original Abhidhamma, as found in the canonical texts, is more. It's I wouldn't say it's simpler. It's highly technical, but it in itself seems to require more explanation and kind of commentary to make it digestible. There's one academic theory that says that the dates the Abhidhamma text to a period roughly around 100 AD, or maybe a little earlier, when at that time it's the same time frame as the Mahayana arose in India. And this is kind of an interesting hypothesis. He says that it was around that time that literacy became more widespread in India. Writing was known to some degree in the Buddhist time, but it was a very specialized, skill that seems to have been used only by merchants and diplomats and so on for sending messages. It was only used for these kind of prosaic purposes. It was no holy books or sacred books of any type were written down until much later. Literacy was starting to come into vogue, at least amongst the middle classes and the lesser merchants and the lesser nobles and so on, and this allowed, for, on the one hand, the arising of and propagation of heretical views in the Mahayana. Whereas before, when everything was transmitted orally, it wasn't really possible to get anyone to go along with chanting something brand new that he just, here's a Paramita Sutta, let's chant that. But when you write it down on a scroll and pass it around, it can be hand copied and eventually transmitted around. And in the case of the Abhidhamma, writing affected it in a different way, because if you've ever looked into secondary literature on Abhidhamma, books about Abhidhamma, they always include tables that are cross-referencing in rows and columns different ideas to make sense of the text. And this author's hypothesis was that it's not really possible to grasp Abhidhamma intellectually in a purely linear fashion. You have to be able to at least imaginatively visualize things in at least two dimensions to make cross-references. And that's very difficult to do if you just have an oral recitation. But if you've got it written down in a text, you can keep referring back. So that makes a certain amount of sense to me. That I like that hypothesis. But of course, that's all it is. We don't know. So the 7 books of the Abhidhamma, let's just go through those briefly. In the traditional order, the first one is given as the Dhamma Sangini. The Dhamma Sangini is probably the most approachable and the basis for much of what we think of as Abhidhamma. It deals with the different categories such as matter, mind, consciousness, and Nibbàna, and analyzes things in a technical way. It serves as the basis for the Abhidhamma that we find in the Visuddhimagga, for example, is mostly based on the Dhamma Sangani. The Vibhanga is a quite similar work, but its analysis is organized differently. It's organized according to categories such as the elements, the faculties, the dependent origination, etc. So it runs over much the same material as the Dhammasangani, but organized in a different way. The Dhatu Kata is a discourse on the elements, and it goes into the sense bases, the aggregates, then the elements. The Dhatu, which gives it the title, Dhatu Kata, discourse on elements, and the elements here being the 4 material elements, and as well as consciousness and space. The Pugala Panyati is, Pugala means persons. It's the analysis of persons, and it mostly goes into what constitutes a stream winner, once returner, non-returner, arahant, etc. And some subcategories of that. The 5th book, although it's probably the last book, and traditionally it's considered the last book added to the canon, but for some reason the traditional order always puts it number 5 of 7, is the Katawatu. And it's quite a different text, and it's attributed to a monk Moggallantissa who lived at the time of King Asoka, and it was added to the canon at the time of King Asoka. And it's quite an interesting work from a historical point of view. It's a book of debates. Katawatu means, the book of discussion, and it's like a debating manual. The Indian culture at the time, and actually to a large degree, even down to the present, Indians loved debate. It was a very big part of their culture was philosophical and religious debates, and there's actually a few of them recorded in the Sutta Pitaka where the Buddha is in debate with a sectarian from some other school. So the Katawatu brings up various questions that are disputed between the different schools, and has a back and forth debate. that this being a Theravada book, the Theravada character always wins the debate in the end. And I could see it being used. How do you respond to someone from the Dharma Guptakas who says such and such? Well, you look at, well, here's the answers in the Katawatu. It seems that the logical structure is often to have the opponent state his position, and then you draw out the implications of his position until he ends up contradicting himself, and then you say, "Aha! This is how many of the debates end. Aha, good sir, you have what you said in the beginning does not agree with what you said in the end. You are defeated. You are refuted." So it's kind of a fun book. It's a bit more than the other Abhidhamma books. It's probably a bit more entertaining if you've got that sort of bent in your mind. Do you like those kind of logical things? The Yamaka is called the Book of Pairs, and it deals with different specific questions, such as are all kusala dhammas roots, mula, or not? And it takes it in a pair of these two factors and see if are they the same or different. So it's dealing with very specific issues or questions of Dhamma. The last book, the seventh, the Patana, is the book of causation, and it's huge. In printed text, it can run to 2,500 pages. I don't know if the entire thing has ever been translated into English. And it deals with one specific, all this massive text deals with one specific aspect of Abhidhamma theory, which is causation. It analyzes everything in terms of 24 types of causation, such as proximity causation, co-nascent, post-nascent. There's all these different ways in which one Dhamma can cause another, and the relationship between two Dhammas in linking them in cause and effect. There's an old tradition in Burma that which makes it, Burma, by the way, is the Buddhist country that places the most emphasis on Abhidhamma study. There's an old tradition that when the Dhamma is lost to the world, the first book to go will be the Patana. It'll be forgotten, and then gradually all the other Abhidhamma Pitaka, then the Sutta Pitaka, and so on. But the Patana is going to be the first to go. So to prevent that from happening, some monks in Burma will memorize parts of the Patana. I don't know if anyone living has memorized the whole thing. It's 2,500 pages, but it used to be done. Maybe there's still somebody doing it. So those are the 7 books of the Abhidhamma, and they all have their commentaries and sub-commentaries, and we'll talk about that in a later session. What else to say about the Abhidhamma in general, the Abhidhamma Pitaka in general? I'm not really so much in this talk wanting to get into Abhidhamma theory, but just to give an overview of the literature. I think that's probably sufficient, and we'll see if there's anything questions I can answer in the chat. Somebody's listed all the books with their English translations. That's good. Abhidhamma Abhidhammata Sangaha is a Buddhist instructional manual. Yes, yeah, we'll deal with that in a subsequent session. It's one of the, I guess, I guess it would really be later than commentaries, sub-commentarial text. How does Abhidhamma explain Anatta in a more technical standpoint? Well, the whole picture of Abhidhamma, there's a couple of answers to this. One is that the whole picture of the understanding given by the Abhidhamma is to analyze the body-mind system into more and more minute detail, and excuse me, and never anywhere finding a self. It's an unnecessary concept. You can explain everything that's happening without any reference to a self, and you bore down into really fine level of detail in the Abhidhamma. Another answer that would be more from the later Abhidhamma period, which is in some sense, Abhidhamma is not just the 7 canonical texts, but it's a whole tradition of development, intellectual development, of philosophizing. The later tradition had a big central idea, is the theory of dhammas, of momentary occurrences of reality, and these are the kind of the bottom level of reality, but they are in themselves empty, they're insubstantial, and they only exist in relation to other dhammas. So there's no standalone unit anywhere. There's no essence to anything. Next one. Which other concepts are explained in some more detail compared to the suttas? For example, the system of the 5 aggregates in the suttas usually doesn't go beyond that in terms of analysis. But the whole thrust of the Dhammasangani is to analyze things into very fine detail. So the aggregate of mental formations or sankharas is listed in particulars. So there's, by the time of the Abhidhammata Sangaha, they had 50 mental formations. So what was just one object, one grouping in the Sutta Pitaka is analyzed in detail and down into 50. The Dhamma Sangani, the original text, had less than 50, but it left the list open. At the end it said, and whatever other states may arise at this time. And the commentarial period, they closed it and left it at 50, which causes some confusion in the English translation of the Visuddhimagga, which I mentioned in my series on that some of the mental states are called or whatever states, which is, in English, is kind of weird, but what it means in Pali is something like the etceteras were left unspecified in the Dhamma Sangani, but by the time of the Visuddhimagga had been listed. Also, the dependent origination is one of the main themes of the Patana, is to explain the different types of causation between the links and the dependent origination. So you don't just say that consciousness is the cause of name and form, but you analyze in what way is consciousness a factor for name and form. Which of the 24 types, and there will be several, which of the 24 types applies here? Okay. I'm gonna have to, straining my eyes, I'm gonna expand it. Okay, that's better. In a retreat with Beth Upton, her most senior student was attending, the first person that Beth was teaching how to discern the patanas. Why does the Burmese have the emphasis on Abhidhamma? If I remember correctly, 3 monks who has memorized all 3 Pitakas, the 41, 42 books are all Burmese monks. Now, the Burmese have always put much more emphasis on the Abhidhamma than the Thais, for example. Although the Abhidhamma is respected and studied in all Buddhist countries, it seems to be a specialty in Burma. I think it goes together with the emphasis on Vipassana, because Vipassana is like the practical way of looking at the mind in fine detail, and the Abhidhamma is the theory about what's happening in the mind in this kind of fine detail. I am looking to become a monk, but I'm looking for both scholarly study and practical, but I'm not sure where to go. Well, I can't really answer that concisely, and here it would depend in part of where you live and what your options are for travel. I don't know how easy it is at the present time to get into Burma, but that may be a Burmese tradition, may be something to look into. There's a Thai tradition. It generally puts much more emphasis on practice than on study. In Sri Lanka, it's kind of the opposite. So you have to investigate your different options. Which parts of the canon are thought to be close to the Buddhist words, and which, like Abhidhamma, are thought to be later interpolations? Now, I dealt with some of this in my talk about the Sutta Pitaka. As far as the best scholarship is to compare the Pali text with the Chinese Agamas and see where they agree. And where they agree, we can be reasonably certain that they date at the latest to the Second Council, which occurred 100 years after the Buddhist time. There's no way of knowing other than that to take it further back. And the good news is that there's generally a broad agreement between the Pali and the Chinese Agamas. So we can have a reasonable surety that the bulk of the Sutta Pitaka dates to no later than the Second Council. Many like who take a kind of linguist or scholarly approach to the texts think that there's a few texts that show signs of being older just by their use of language, and one of these is the Sutta Nibbàna, which uses some forms that are not found elsewhere, that they're thought to be older. For example, one thing that stands out in the Sutta Nibbàna is that the character Sakka, king of the gods, is always referred to by his older name Inda, which is the Pali version of Indra from the Vedas, in the Sutta Nipata, and seldom elsewhere. Next. Second question, Bhante. Have you read about Ashoka and Ptolemy, the second Philadelphus embassies exchange? I have a strong feeling Buddhist monks were chilling in Alexandria 2200 to 2250 years ago. Yeah, Ashoka did send missionaries, Buddhist missionaries all over the place, and both east and west. Some of them went to Sawana Bhumi, which is the Golden Land, which means Southeast Asia, Burma, Thailand, and some went to the west, to the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires that in the Greek world. It's quite likely that there were Buddhist monks in Alexandria. There were this is kind of a odd detail that may be indicative of something. Before the Christianization of Egypt under the later Romans, there was already a monastic kind of organization that were called the Theraputa, that lived in celibate lives and devoted to study and contemplation. And it has been suggested that they were, if not directly, immediately Buddhist, they were derived from Buddhism. And they then when Alexandria was Christianized, many of these just continued their same lifestyle and just changed their doctrinal idea, the doctrinal part of their existence. So it may be that Buddhism was actually if this is correct, was Christian monasticism started in Egypt. It may be that Christian monasticism was an indirect outgrowth of Buddhist monasticism. It's kind of hypothetical, but it's interesting. Was the Buddha's enlightenment realized through wisdom or contemplation? How about the contents of the Abhidhamma? Well, through wisdom or contemplation. I don't really see the difference. I mean, the Buddha attained his enlightenment through meditation under the Bodhi tree, and the dawning of wisdom that occurred there through the act of contemplation. I didn't get a chance to ask last time, how did the Bhikkhuni order disband? It's to do with the Sri Lankan history, because in the Theravada world, the Bhikkhuni tradition was never strongly established outside of Sri Lanka. There is some record of the Bhikkhunis in Thailand, but they may have just been visiting from Sri Lanka. We don't know, but there certainly was no strong movement there of Bhikkhunis. I think up until recent times it was thought there were none, but somebody has come up with some references. But there was a strong, thriving Bhikkhuni order in Sri Lanka, but there was a period in Sri Lankan history they suffered. Sri Lankans had a very tumultuous history. They've suffered from foreign invasions and so on, basically forever, between the Tamils coming out of India and then 3 waves of European invaders, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British. And there was a period in the early modern period when between the 1600s and 1700s, then even the bhikkhu order died out because there weren't enough bhikkhus left to perform an ordination ceremony. And the bhikkhuni order died out at the same time because the Buddhism was in serious decline because of the chaos in the country, and it was later reestablished out of Thailand, or Siam it was then called. So there's the main body of monks in Sri Lanka now are called the Siam Nikai, because they trace their lineage back to Siam. But the Thais, or the Siamese, didn't have any Bhikkhunis to send to reestablish a Bhikkhuni order. Bhikkhuni order survived in Dharmagupta tradition, which probably also came out of Sri Lanka, possibly, quite likely actually, and went to East Asia. So there was a thriving Bhikshuni order in China and Taiwan, and there still is. And Taiwan is like the main country of Bhikshunis today. And the modern Theravada Bhikkhunis are established by ordination out of that Taiwanese tradition. My last question, could people call you to ask questions at the Wat Temple Monastery? I'm in Chicago from Mongolia with the monks with babies and have jobs. Well, that Vajrayana, that's, I don't know, it's quite different. No, it's not really convenient to call me. I will answer questions by email. Can you explain briefly on what the Patana elaborates on dependent origination we should know about? You can get a brief, relatively brief, in 20, 30 pages, summary of that in the Visuddhimagga, Path of Purification. There's section on, the section on dependent origination goes into which of the 24 causal factors relate to each of the stages of dependent origination. And that would be the best way to answer that question. You get that, that, unless you really got a super scholarly ambition, that's enough of the patana for a practical purpose. Mata, you missed one question someone asked at the very beginning of the chat, a guy named Gregory. Wish you would do a video on this, maybe collaborate with Ajahn Soni. It seems to like early Buddhist history. I don't like the way this chat is set up. It breaks up people's questions into parts. In Mongolian, we are responsible for decline. In Burma, last record was in 1380s. Kuni declaration due to Mongol wars. Yeah, I'm not too sure about. I'm sorry that I'm having a hard time making sense of that question because it's split up into several parts interspersed with other people's material. So I'll just go on. If the Abhidhamma content was realized similar to the Buddhist realization, or if it was mental analytical exercise purely, or both, I think it was a combination of. It's certainly analytical and involves a the kind of intellectual side of studying it, but I have the feeling it was based that the monks who developed Abhidhamma over the centuries, they probably had a very strong base in some kind of vipassana type meditation, examining the mind as a raw material for the detailed Abhidhamma study. You shouldn't. This kind of brings up another. This is a little bit off the beat of your question, but it just occurred to me something that is also interesting about the origins of Abhidhamma. And there's a considerable Greek influence on Abhidhamma in the later phases of its development. There was that branch of the Hellenic civilization in northeast India, or what would now be northwest India, I should say, on what would now be Pakistan and Afghanistan, the Gandharan civilization that had a kind of mixed Indian and Greek tradition. And there's a lot of the approach of Abhidhamma, seems kind of more Greek than Indian in some ways. What absolutely negates a person from ordaining as a monk in Theravada tradition? There are 10 disqualifications. As part of the ordination ceremony, you're asked these different questions. You have to be, the ones that are really practical, you have to be out of debt. You can't ordain to escape obligations like that. You have to be out of debt. You have to not be liable for military service, and you have to be free of various diseases that are listed. And it's kind of difficult in translation to know exactly what diseases they're referring to, but it would probably be contagious diseases of different kinds. And the very first question is, are you human? Menososi. You have to be human. It's a bare minimum requirement. Someone's trying. Okay, John Adams is trying to make sense of his previous question that I had trouble understanding. I'm sorry, Bhante, for tangled senses. I meant it was due to Mongol wars in the 1300s and pagan Valley Upper Burma the Bhikkhuni order died out, or so in 1386 or so, the last recorded Bhikkhuni lineage. Now that's interesting. I don't know as much about Burmese history. I think that it sounds likely that certainly then by the time the Bhikkhuni order was reestablished, or by the time the Bhikkhu order was reestablished in Sri Lanka, the Bhikkhuni order, if it had existed in Burma earlier, had been long gone. Hello, I feel drawn to Christianity, Hindu, and Buddhism, but I feel split. What should I do? Read The Life of Pi. I'll just leave it at that. Get that. It's a fairly short book. Get The Life of Pi. You'll relate to the main character. Have there been non-humans that tried to go forth before? Yes, that's the reason for that rule, is that a Naga, these serpent beings, he assumed the human form. They're shapeshifters, and he assumed the human form and took ordination. But when a Naga sleeps, he reverts naturally to his serpent form, and as a junior novice, they were all sleeping together in a kind of a dormitory arrangement, and he turned into a snake, a gigantic snake in the middle of the night, terrified all the other novices, and they all went running out helter-skelter. And when it came to the attention of the Buddha, he said, okay, we're not going to ordain any non-humans anymore. So I think at that note, we'll shut it down for today. That was kind of interesting. It was more interesting than I thought it would be. Abhidhamma. It brought out some good questions. So next week I don't know if I'll deal with it in one session or two, but I want to go on to the Atthakatha, the commentaries, and we'll see you next time.